There are many researchers who are raising some fundamental questions about the whole theory of evolution, not minor questions, but things that challenge the very concept. But we find that such views are not represented in the curriculum in science education. Neither are such views expressed in the mainstream scientific institutions, and we also see that such views are not very much present in the mainstream media, which is looking towards the representatives of mainstream science for guidance. So why is this? One reason is that today the supporters of the Darwinian theory of evolution have a monopoly in the education systems and scientific institutions throughout most of the world today. And it's quite natural that if you possess a monopoly in the education system, that you do not want to lose that monopoly. It's a kind of power. There are different kinds of power in the world today. There's political power, there's economic power, there's military power. There's also intellectual power, which is a very subtle power, but a very real one. And we see that those who have power, particularly those who have monopoly power, don't like to give it up very easily. For example, if one political party has a monopoly on the political life of a country, it doesn't want to give up its position very easily. If one corporation has a monopoly in a certain sector of the economy, it doesn't like to give up its position very, very easily. So similarly, if one group of scientists within the scientific world has a monopoly in the education systems and scientific institutions, it's quite natural that it won't want to give up its monopoly power very easily. So the way that the supporters of the current Darwinian theory of evolution exercise their monopoly power in the education systems and scientific institutions is by the systematic exclusion of alternative ideas from the science curriculum in the education system and from the normal work in the scientific institutions. And one reason for this is that the alternatives to the current Darwinian theory of evolution generally involve some kind of higher intelligence or non-material substances like consciousness as something that can exist apart from matter. And today, scientists are very reluctant to accept such things. And this reluctance goes back to the foundation of some of the original scientific institutions in Europe, like the Royal Institution in London and several others, academies of science in various parts of Europe. And they decided to deliberately exclude from their scientific work anything non-material. And in a sense, that was very productive to look just at matter as it can be explained and controlled and studied and experimented upon in reproducible ways. That was in one sense very productive for the world of science. It resulted in a lot of new technology, which has expanded all over the world. But in leaving out these other features of reality, something was lost. If we go back to the world of science in Europe and the West a few centuries ago, we see that many scientists were actively dealing with God and spiritual things in their scientific work. They didn't make a distinction as we do today between science and religion. Both things were integrated in a whole concept of reality. For example, Sir Isaac Newton, the founder of modern physics, wrote as much about spiritual topics and mystical topics as he did about his physics and optics. And for him, they were all part of the same system for having a comprehensive understanding of how reality is composed of different elements. One of them being some supreme conscious being who is responsible for the overall order and structure that we see in material reality. And he also wrote a lot about alchemy, which involves different kinds of things that are now regarded as mystical. The idea of subtle influences and subtle material elements. So if we go back a few centuries in Europe and the West, we see that the scientific picture of reality included a whole lot more than it does today. But at a certain point, they decided to simply focus on the ordinary material elements, to leave out anything to do with subtle material elements or non-material substances or divine intervention and control. They decided to focus on ordinary matter operating according to laws that they could study and experiment on and get reproducible results on. And that was very productive for science in this sense, that scientists learned how to control matter in some very interesting ways, which resulted in a lot of technology and industrial development, economic development, military development, the development of different kinds of pharmaceuticals and medical practices that were very effective on a certain level. But because they ignored these other aspects of reality, there are a lot of problems in the world today. Yes, we have all of this technology, but it's being used to destroy our environment. There's a lot of unnecessary greed and competition in the world, a lot of conflict in the world on every level of reality. And I believe that the solution to these problems can only come when science again expands its conception of reality to include not only ordinary matter, but the more subtle forms of matter and the non-material types of substances, and also the idea that there is something more going on than matter operating according to its own laws. There's some kind of overall intelligence guiding the whole process. There's some overall intelligence that's responsible for the order and complexity that we observe both in the biological world and the physical world. So without returning to that more integrated picture of reality, I think our problems are going to continue. But the problem is that those who favor this more limited picture of scientific reality today have a monopoly, a government-enforced monopoly, in the education systems and scientific institutions in the world today. And this, I think, prevents a real full development of the scientific and intellectual potential of the world today. And I think the solution is for governments to end the monopoly that Darwinian evolutionary scientists operating according to a materialistic, reductionistic metaphysics have in the education systems and scientific institutions of the world today, which are supported by the tax money of all the people. Now, all the people don't agree with the conclusions that are being enforced upon them by those who have this monopoly in the education systems and the scientific institutions. I think we need more diversity and tolerance in the scientific world. It's a fact that today most scientists accept the Darwinian theory of evolution, but it's also a fact that there are some who don't accept it and who are proposing different kinds of alternatives. Those who are proposing the alternatives are in the minority, but that does not mean that in a free society they and their ideas should be excluded from the education systems and the scientific institutions by those who now are imposing a monopoly in these institutions. So I think the correct solution is to allow some diversity, and this doesn't necessarily mean throwing out the Darwinian theory of evolution. It just means recognizing that there are alternatives and allowing those alternative proposals to have a place in the official curriculum and in the work of the scientific institutions in terms of funding that's granted to researchers and things like that. My proposal would be that there should be representative. My proposal is that there should be proportionate representation in the education system and world of science. Let's say today that 95% of the scientists working in biology accept the Darwinian theory of evolution. Okay, let's accept that as a fact. But it's also a fact, and everyone knows it, that there are scientists who don't accept the Darwinian theory of evolution and who are proposing alternatives, intelligent design being one of them. So I would propose, all right, in the textbooks of biology, give the Darwinian theory of evolution 95% of the textbook pages, but in the remaining pages there should be some acknowledgement, some neutral, objective acknowledgement that there are scientists who don't accept the Darwinian theory of evolution and who are proposing alternatives. This should be acknowledged in a neutral, objective fashion in the official textbooks, in the education system. And the research policies of scientific institutions should set aside a certain percentage of their research funds for those who are performing their research according to these alternative ideas. I would say 5% of the research funds. Now, I think if that were done, gradually we would see the situation changing a little bit. Today, many students and many scientists and many other professionals are afraid to express any interest in these alternative ideas because they're officially excluded from the scientific institutions and the institutions. For example, let's say that in a country we have a parliament. And in that parliament we have a dominant political party. And then we also have in the parliament some small political parties. Now, a voter in an election may decide, well, I know this party is not going to be in the majority, it's not going to be part of the government, but I like their ideas. I think they're very good ideas. I'm going to vote my convictions. And even though I know my party is not going to be in the government now, because of their ideas, I'm going to vote for them. Maybe we'll get a seat or two in Parliament. But what if that party, that small party, is outlawed, declared illegal by the government? Then nobody, even if they accept its ideas, are going to vote for it. And I'm not saying because they're actually doing something illegal. I'm saying that the majority party in the government outlaws the smaller parties just to preserve its monopoly and power. So, of course, then nobody can identify with such a party. It's illegitimate. It's been effectively marginalized. So I think the same thing is going on in the education system today and in the scientific institutions. Certain small minority opinions have been marginalized and delegitimized unfairly by those who now have a majority position in the scientific world. Many scientists like to talk about Galileo. Several centuries ago in Europe, Galileo had some different ideas about the solar system, which opposed the doctrines of the church of his time. But because the church had a dominant influence in society, because the church had influence over government, they were able to effectively marginalize and suppress Galileo at that time. Today, it is the scientists who have influence over government policy and education. And I'm not talking about all scientists, I'm talking about the majority group within the scientific world that now supports the Darwinian theory of evolution is using their majority influence within the scientific world to influence governments like the EU government, the United States government, and other governments, to give them a monopoly in the education system and exclude, by government policy, alternative and opposing views. I think that's not a very healthy situation for democratic free societies to have that sort of thing going on. So I think the proper solution is to allow the opposing and alternative ideas proportionate representation in the education system and within the scientific institutions in free societies. And if that is done, if the unfair advantage that the supporters of the current Darwinian theory of evolution have is ended, and they really have to compete on fair ground with opposing and alternative ideas, then I think we would see some changes, even within the majority. I don't think that the current majority would remain. I think if there were open, free discussion and debate, if there was an open education system where students felt free to examine the competing ideas and make their own choices without fear that their scientific careers would be ended, then I think gradually we would see more and more people adopting what are now considered to be the alternative and opposing views, I think we would see that people in general would be getting a more balanced picture from the media, the mainstream media, who would be able to talk with scientists who have different views and report about them. Now, this isn't the case, because those who are supporting the alternative and opposing views have been delegitimized, have been marginalized, have been suppressed and artificially excluded from the education system and the world of science, and effectively also from mainstream media communication.